The first warning came at 5:17 in the morning.
This says it's
A
mine
sharp
now,
beep
Clara.
broke the silence in Clara Bennett's kitchen.
You need to
Then
move
the old
aside.
radio on the
You
windowsill
won't get
crackled
away
to
with
life.
this.
A severe storm system is moving toward Red
Rain's
Willow
coming
Valley,
early.
the announcer said. Wind gusts may exceed 55 miles per hour, with heavy rain and possible hail. Farmers are advised to protect or harvest
This land
vulnerable
cannot
crops
support
within
both
the
of us
next
anymore,
36
Clara.
hours.
I am
Clara
not just
sat at
gonna
the
walk
table
away
with
from it,
both hands
Silas.
wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. Outside the window, her wheat field stretched toward the western tree line. Most of it had turned pale gold, but the lower sections still carried streaks of green. In a normal year, she would have waited another 4 days. This was not a normal year. Less than 10 minutes after the warning, the first combine passed her house. Its headlights were still on as it rolled down the county road, followed by 2 grain trucks
She's
and
only
a pickup
cutting that
carrying
one narrow
fuel.
strip.
By 6 o'clock, the entire valley seemed to be moving. Barn doors opened, engines started, workers were called from their beds, neighbors shouted over the noise of machinery as they calculated
shouldn't
how
be
many
this hot.
acres they could cut before the storm arrived. The radio repeated
Dangerously
the
high
warning every
temperatures are
20
reported.
minutes.
A
Harvest
sour
as
smell
soon
is
as
now vent
possible.
from inside
Do
bin
not
7.
leave mature crops
Evacuate the
exposed.
immediate area.
Local grain elevators will remain open through the night. Clara switched it off. She pulled on her father's old boots and walked into the field. The morning air was warm, but the wind was still weak. She stopped near the edge of the wheat, pulled one head from the stalk, and rubbed the kernels into her palm. She pressed one with her thumbnail. It left a small dent, still too soft. She walked farther into the field and tested another section. The result was the same. The upper stalks were dry, but the lower stems still bent instead of snapping. Moisture remained inside the plants. A
We
truck
shouldn't have
engine
rushed it.
growled behind her. A black pickup stopped beside the fence.
It's all gone, Clara.
Silas Reed lowered the window. Silas owned nearly 800 acres, 3 modern combines, and most of the grain drying capacity in the valley. When other farmers were still making decisions, he was usually already working. "You heard the warning?" he asked. "Yes. My south field will be finished before noon. I can send one of my machines over after that." Clara looked toward her wheat. "Thank you, but I'm not harvesting today." Silas stared at her. "You have 36 hours. Maybe less," Clara said. "Maybe more." He opened the door and stepped out. Across the road, combines were already cutting long golden paths through the neighboring fields. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds. "The whole valley is harvesting," he said. "I can see that. They don't issue warnings like this without a reason." Clara held out the kernel she had tested. Silas did not take it. "You plan to argue with a storm using 1 grain of wheat?" "No. I'm trying to understand what I could lose by harvesting too early. If the grain is damp, dry it. Do you still have room?" Silas paused. That was answer enough. Every large farm in the valley was cutting at once. By evening, the dryers would be running at full capacity. Wet grain would sit in trucks, bins, and temporary piles waiting for space. And wet grain did not always wait safely. Silas stepped closer to the fence. "Your father would never leave a crop standing with a storm coming." Clara tightened her fingers around the kernels. Since her father's death 8 months earlier, every decision she made had been measured against his. When she changed the irrigation schedule, people said he would not have done it. When she refused to sell part of the farm to reduce the debt, they said he had been more practical. Now even the storm was being used to remind her that the land had once belonged to someone more experienced. "My father didn't harvest just because everyone else was afraid," she said. Silas shook his head. "I'll come back at noon. By then, I hope you have a different answer." He drove away, leaving a thin cloud of dust over the road. Clara continued toward the northern fence. A faded red ribbon was tied to one of the posts. Her father had used it to watch the wind. According to the forecast, it should have been stretched toward the east. Instead, it drifted weakly toward the northeast. Clara looked up. The high clouds were moving faster than the lower ones. The 2 layers were not traveling in exactly the same direction. It did not prove the storm would turn, but it was worth watching. She opened the small notebook in her jacket pocket and wrote, 6:42 a.m., surface wind weak, high clouds shifting northeast, kernels still soft, lower stems holding moisture. From the field across the road came the steady roar of a combine. Each pass of the cutting blades sounded like a clock counting down. By 8 o'clock, Clara's phone had begun to ring. The bank wanted to know her harvest plan. The grain buyer wanted confirmation of the delivery date. 2 neighbors called to ask whether her combine had broken down. Clara answered none of them. She entered the machinery shed and pulled the tarp from her father's old combine. The fuel tank was full. The cutting blades had been sharpened. All she had to do was turn the key. Her hand rested on the cab door. For several seconds she almost climbed inside. Then she looked down at the kernels in her palm. A storm could flatten a field in minutes, but grain harvested too early could spoil from the inside, quietly and invisibly, before anyone understood what was happening. Clara closed the cab door. Instead of starting the combine, she took a small sickle and 3 cloth sacks from the tool shelf. She would not harvest the whole field, not yet, but she needed a test. As she walked back toward the wheat, the kitchen radio came through the open window. "The storm is gaining speed." Clara stopped for a moment. Then she kept walking. Across the valley, every combine was still running. Only her field remained untouched. 8 months earlier, Clara had stood in the same field wearing a black coat and muddy boots. Her father's funeral had ended before noon. By evening, 3 people had already asked what she planned to do with the farm. No one asked whether she wanted to keep it. They asked when she would sell. The Bennett farm had once covered nearly 400 acres. Years of medical bills, bad prices, and 2 dry seasons had reduced it to less than half that size. The remaining land was fertile, but the equipment was old, the storage buildings needed repairs, and the bank still held a large note against the property. Clara's father had kept all of that from her as long as he could. She found the loan documents 2 days after his death. They were inside a metal box beneath his desk, filed beside seed receipts, soil reports, and 30 years of handwritten weather records. The final notice from the bank was on top, payment due after harvest. Clara read it 3 times. If the coming crop failed, the farm would not survive another season. At the time, she had been working in a small agricultural laboratory 2 counties away. Her job was stable. The hours were clean. Nothing depended on rain, fuel prices, or the condition of a machine older than she was. Everyone expected her to return to that life. Silas Reed made his offer 1 week after the funeral. He arrived in a polished truck and placed a folder on the kitchen table. The price was low but high enough to clear the debt. "You can walk away without owing anyone," he told her. Clara opened the folder but did not sign. "What happens to the land?" "I combine it with my western fields." "And the windbreak?" Silas glanced toward the rows of cottonwood and cedar her father had planted decades earlier. "Some of those trees take up good ground. They keep the soil from blowing. They also shade nearly 12 acres. Clara closed the folder. That answer told her what she needed to know. Silas was not trying to preserve the farm. He was trying to absorb it. "I'm not selling," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You know how to test soil in a lab. That's not the same as running a farm." "No," Clara said. "But it's a start." Silas leaned back in his chair. "This place needs more than a start." He was right. The combine needed a new belt. The north fence was collapsing. 2 grain bins had broken fans. The irrigation pump leaked, and the tractor burned oil whenever it worked uphill. Clara had enough savings to fix only some of it. She chose the combine belt, the pump, and 1 bin fan. The rest would have to wait. By spring, the town had formed its opinion. Clara Bennett was keeping the farm because she was grieving. She would last 1 season, perhaps 2. Then the bank would take what pride had prevented her from selling. At the feed store, conversations often stopped when she entered. Older farmers gave advice without being asked. Some spoke slowly as though she had never seen wheat before. One man suggested she rent the fields to Silas and learn from a safe distance. Another told her that sentiment did not pay interest. Clara listened without arguing. Then she went home and worked. She repaired the irrigation lines herself. She replaced worn bearings in the grain auger. She studied her father's planting records and found that the lower field always ripened later because moisture collected near the old creek bed. She also noticed something else. Her father had never treated the farm as one uniform piece of land. He had divided it into small zones. The western slope dried first. The northern edge held moisture longer. The soil behind the windbreak remained cooler during hot weeks. The low field could not be planted or harvested on the same schedule as the ridge. To everyone else, it was 1 wheat field. To her father, it had been 12 different fields sharing the same fence. Clara began rebuilding his system. She marked each section on a hand-drawn map. She recorded soil temperature, moisture, wind direction, and the date each patch changed color. Some neighbors called it unnecessary. Silas called it laboratory farming, but Clara was not trying to make the land behave like a set of numbers. She was using numbers to understand how differently each part behaved. By early summer, the crop looked better than anyone expected. Not perfect. The eastern edge was thin. A section near the road had suffered from weeds, but the center field stood dense and even, and the lower ground had recovered after a slow start. For the first time since her father's death, Clara believed she might make the payment. Then the storm warning came. Now she stood inside the machinery shed with the bank's number flashing on her phone. She let it ring twice before answering. Clara Bennett. Ms. Bennett, this is Daniel Mercer from County First Bank. We've seen the weather advisory. I have too. We understand most farms in your area have started harvesting. Most of them have. There was a pause. Have you? Not yet. The silence on the other end changed. Daniel's voice became more formal. The crop is part of the collateral securing your operating loan. I know. We need assurance that you're taking reasonable steps to protect it. I'm testing moisture levels now. The Weather Service is predicting severe conditions, and the grain is not ready. Ms. Bennett, the bank cannot base its risk assessment on personal judgment alone. Clara looked through the open shed door. Beyond the yard, neighboring combines moved through clouds of dust. What would you like me to base mine on? She asked. The official forecast, standard harvest practice, the decisions being made by experienced operators in your area. You mean Silas? I mean farmers with a proven record. The words landed harder than Daniel intended. Clara tightened her grip on the phone. My father had a proven record. Your father is not the borrower now. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel softened his tone. We're not trying to pressure you. We need to know the crop will be secured. I'll call you after I finish the tests. Please do that before noon. The call ended. Clara remained still for several seconds. Then she placed the phone on the workbench and opened the cloth sacks she had brought from the field. Each sack held wheat from a different section: the ridge, the center, the low ground. She labeled them and carried them toward the old testing table near the back wall. Her father had built it from scrap lumber. Above it hung a narrow shelf filled with glass jars, a small scale, and a dented metal moisture tester. Clara poured the first sample into the device. The needle moved. She wrote down the result. Then she tested the second. Higher. The third was higher still. She checked all three again. The numbers confirmed what her fingers had already told her. The wheat was close, but close was not ready. Outside, another combine passed on the county road. Clara looked at the samples lined across the table. If she waited and the storm struck directly, the crop could lodge, shatter, or be ruined by hail. If she harvested now, she would be sending damp grain into a storage system already nearing its limit. Either decision could cost her the farm. The difference was that one risk was visible: dark clouds, strong wind, heavy rain. The other could begin quietly inside a grain bin. Heat, condensation, mold. Clara reached for her father's weather notebook. On the inside cover, he had written one sentence in faded blue ink: "Never let fear make the decision before the field does." She read it twice. Then she turned to a clean page and began planning the next test. Clara carried the weather notebook to the kitchen and spread it open beside the 3 wheat samples. Most of the pages were filled with numbers: temperatures, rainfall, wind direction, planting dates, harvest dates, notes about insects, soil cracks, and the color of the western sky. To anyone else, the book might have looked disorganized. Clara knew better. Her father had never trusted a single sign. He believed the land spoke in patterns. When Clara was 12, he had taken her into the field before sunrise and handed her a wheat head. "Tell me whether it's ready," he said. She looked at its golden color. "It looks ready." "That's what your eyes say. Ask the grain." He showed her how to roll the head between her palms and separate the kernels. Then he placed one between his teeth. A ripe kernel cracked, an unripe one bent. "Color tells you where to begin," he said. "Texture tells you whether to believe it." Over the years, he taught her other signs. Dry wheat stalks snapped near the base, immature stalks folded. A field that appeared evenly golden from the road could still hold damp pockets in low ground. Morning dew that remained late on the lower leaves meant moisture was still trapped beneath the canopy. Birds feeding heavily along one edge of a field could reveal where grain had ripened first. Even the sound mattered. Ready wheat made a dry, papery whisper in the wind. Damp wheat moved with a heavier rustle. Clara had once laughed at that. You can't schedule a harvest by listening to plants. Her father had smiled. No, but you can avoid a bad schedule by listening before you make one. He was not against forecasts or instruments. The kitchen wall had held a barometer for as long as Clara could remember. He checked it every morning. He listened to the radio and marked storm systems on county maps. But he never confused a regional forecast with the exact conditions of his own field. The forecast tells us what may enter the valley, he used to say. The field tells us what can survive it. Clara turned through the notebook until she found the records from 11 years earlier. That season, a storm had been predicted during harvest. Most of the valley had cut early. Her father had waited 2 days. At first, Clara thought she had found proof that he would support her decision. Then she read the next line. Lost 6 acres on West Edge, waited too long. She stopped. Her father had not been infallible. The storm had changed direction, but the edge of his field had still been flattened by wind. On the following page he had written, correct observation, poor preparation. Clara read the sentence again. He had not blamed the forecast. He had blamed himself for recognizing the risk and failing to strengthen the vulnerable part of the field. Below that note was a list. Clear drainage channels. Repair west fence. Thin damaged branches in windbreak. Harvest exposed strip first. Do not treat whole field as one decision. Clara looked toward the window. The western edge of her field was the most exposed section of the farm. It sat slightly higher than the rest and received the full force of storms entering the valley. If the wind came from the southwest, the cottonwoods would protect the center. If it shifted west, the outer acres would take the first impact. She returned to the shed and unfolded her hand-drawn field map. Her original choice had been simple: harvest or wait. Her father's notes offered a third option: divide the risk. Clara marked a narrow strip along the western edge. It represented less than 10% of the crop. The wheat there was slightly drier because the soil drained faster and the wind reached it more easily. She could harvest that section first. It would not save the entire farm if the storm hit directly, but it would remove the most vulnerable grain without forcing her to cut the wetter center and low ground. Her phone vibrated. Silas. She let it ring once, then answered. Have you changed your mind? He asked. I'm harvesting the western strip. All of it? No. A long breath came through the phone. That isn't how a storm works, Clara. It isn't how this field works either. You think the wind will respect your map? No. I think some parts are more exposed than others. Silas was silent for a moment. Then he said, one of my combines can be there in 20 minutes. I'll use ours. Your machine hasn't run a full harvest since last season. It ran yesterday. For 10 minutes in the yard. That was enough to check it. It was enough to hear the engine turn over. Clara looked at the old combine through the shed doorway. Silas was right again. The machine had been serviced, but it had not been tested under load. A broken belt or overheated bearing could delay her at the worst possible moment. I appreciate the offer, she said, but I need to know what my machine can do. You are making every part of this harder than it needs to be. Maybe. When the rain starts, remember that I tried. The call ended. Clara climbed into the combine cab. The seat still carried a split along the left side, repaired with silver tape. A small brass keychain hung from the ignition. Her father had used it for years. She turned the key. The engine coughed, shuddered, and then settled into a deep vibration. Clara waited, watching the gauges. Oil pressure steady, temperature normal, fuel full. She lowered the header and drove toward the western strip. The first cut was uneven. She had guided the machine before, but never alone during a real harvest. The header dipped too low at the edge and pulled in more straw than necessary. She adjusted. On the second pass, the cut became cleaner. Wheat disappeared beneath the header. Grain moved through the machine and collected in the tank behind her. From the road, 2 neighbors slowed their trucks to watch. One lifted a hand in greeting. The other shook his head. Clara ignored them. She stopped after 3 passes and climbed down. The cut grain looked good, but the sample in the tank was still slightly damp. She checked the stalks left on the ground. The The western strip was ready enough to dry safely with proper airflow. The center field was not. That distinction mattered. By noon, Clara had harvested only 14 acres. Around her, neighboring farms had cut hundreds. Silas returned as promised and parked beside the fence. He stepped out while Clara was unloading grain into an old wagon. "That's all you're taking?" he asked. "For now. You have the machine running. Keep going." Clara held up a handful of grain from the wagon. "This section is drier." "Not dry. Drier." "Yes." Silas looked toward the untouched center of the field. The sky above it remained bright, but a darker line had formed far to the west. "You may not get another chance." Clara looked at the clouds, then at the grain in her hand. "My father made this same decision once," she said. "And? He was partly right." Silas frowned. "That's not comforting." "It shouldn't be." She explained the old record, the delayed harvest, the wind damage, and the lesson about treating the field as separate zones. Silas listened, but his expression did not soften. "You're using an 11-year-old storm to predict this one." "No, I'm using it to avoid repeating an 11-year-old mistake." Silas looked at the cut western strip. For the first time that morning, he did not have an immediate reply. Then his radio crackled from inside the truck. A voice reported that the elevator line had reached the highway. Another farmer said the main dryer was already backed up. Silas reached for the radio. "Tell them to start using temporary storage." The answer came quickly. "Most of it's full." Silas glanced at Clara. She said nothing. The problem she feared had already begun. Wet grain was arriving faster than the valley could dry it. Silas raised the radio again and issued instructions to redirect several trucks to his northern bins. Then he turned back to Clara. "You still have time. So do the colonels. You sound certain." "I'm not." That answer surprised him. Clara closed her hand around the grain. "I could be wrong about the storm. I could be wrong about how much wind the field can take, but I'm not wrong about the moisture." Silas looked once more toward the darkening western horizon. "Certainty would be cheaper," he said. "Only until it's wrong." He returned to his truck. Clara watched him leave, then carried the harvested sample into the shed. She poured it into a small metal bin with a ventilation fan beneath it. The grain from the test strip would be monitored separately from the rest. That afternoon, she walked every boundary of the farm. At the western windbreak, she found 2 dead limbs hanging over the fence. They could break loose and damage the trees beside them. Near the low field, weeds and soil had clogged one of the old drainage channels. Behind the equipment shed, several wooden fence panels were loose. The storm had not arrived yet. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Clara sharpened a saw, took a shovel from the wall, and began with the dead branches. As she worked, the wind finally strengthened. The red ribbon on the northern post pulled tight. Not east, northeast. Clara looked toward the clouds. Her father had taught her to observe before acting. His notebook had taught her something harder. Observation alone was not enough. She had to prepare for the possibility that she was wrong. By late afternoon, the storm had taken over every radio and television in Red Willow Valley. The weather station had upgraded its warning. The strongest part of the system was expected shortly after midnight, bringing heavy rain, damaging wind, and possible hail. Clara listened from the lower field while clearing mud and weeds from an old drainage channel. She was not ignoring the warning. The most exposed western strip had already been harvested. Dead branches had been removed from the windbreak. Loose roof panels were secured. Machinery had been moved away from the trees, and the main drainage routes were open. But most of the wheat was still standing. At 4:26 p.m., Clara checked the barometer hanging inside the shed. The pressure was falling, though more slowly than the latest forecast suggested. She stepped outside and studied the sky. The high clouds were moving northeast. The lower clouds were moving almost directly east. At ground level, the wind still came from the south. The signs did not agree. That did not mean the storm would miss the farm. It meant the system was changing as it approached the valley. Clara wrote the observations in her notebook, then opened one of her father's old weather records. He had documented similar conditions twice. In one case, a storm had divided near the northern ridge. In the other, it had strengthened and crossed the valley without turning. The pattern offered a possibility, not a promise. Clara closed the notebook. She would not gamble the farm on clouds alone. She walked into the center field and tested several wheat heads. The warm afternoon wind had dried the outer husks, but the kernels still dented beneath her thumbnail. They were closer, still not ready. A truck horn sounded from the road. Ellen Holloway had stopped beside the gate. Dust covered her cap and work shirt. Her family farmed the eastern side of the valley. "You're still waiting?" Ellen asked. "Most of the field. We finished an hour ago." "How wet was the grain?" "Higher than we wanted." "Where did you take it?" "Silas's northern bins." Clara looked toward the Reed property in the distance. The northern bins were older and had weaker ventilation than the main storage facility. "Did they test every load?" "The first truck," Ellen said. "After that, the line was too long." "How long?" "Nearly a mile by the time we left." Clara said nothing. Ellen pressed a kernel taken from Clara's field. "It dented easily. We didn't have another choice," she said. "You chose the danger you could see." Ellen looked toward the western sky. "And you chose the one you can't predict." "That's true." The dark cloud line had grown wider, swallowing the last clear strip above the ridge. "If hail comes through here," Clara continued, "your crop is safe and mine may be gone. And if it doesn't, then we find out whether your grain reaches the dryers before it starts heating." Ellen studied her for a moment. "I hope you're right." "So do I." Ellen returned to her truck. Before leaving, she lowered the window. "Silas is telling people you delayed because you couldn't afford fuel." Clara gave a tired smile. "By tomorrow, they'll either forget that story or invent a better one." After the truck disappeared, Clara returned to the shed. The grain from the western strip had been inside the ventilated metal bin for less than 4 hours. She pushed a temperature probe into the center. The reading had risen. Not enough to indicate spoilage, but enough to prove the grain was still releasing heat. She checked another spot. Warmer again. The fan beneath the bin was keeping the temperature under control. Without airflow, the heat would continue building inside the grain. Clara pictured hundreds of truckloads sitting in crowded storage across the valley. Her 14 acres were manageable. Half the valley was not. She called Silas. He answered over the roar of an auger. "What is it? Are the fans running in the northern bins?" "Everything is running. Have you checked the temperature in the center of the grain?" "We're still unloading." "That means no. It means I have 40 trucks in the yard. And wet grain entering faster than you can dry it." Silas's voice hardened. "It's under control. My test bin is already warming. You have 14 acres in a small ventilated bin. I have a commercial operation. That is exactly why I'm calling." A brief silence followed. Then Silas said, "Worry about your own field." The call ended. Clara lowered the phone. She had expected him to dismiss her. What concerned her was that he sounded too busy to verify whether he was right. At sunset, the sky turned dark purple. The wheat looked almost white beneath it. The red ribbon on the northern fence pulled east, then slackened and shifted northeast again. Clara checked the latest radar image. The storm line had started bending around the western ridge. Its northern section was strengthening. The southern section was moving more slowly. Her farm remained between them. She enlarged the image, but the map could not tell her what the field itself would endure. Clara put the phone away and continued preparing. At the southwest corner, she found several acres leaning more heavily than the rest. She pulled one plant from the soil and examined its roots. They were shallow. The section had received frequent surface irrigation during the hottest part of summer. The plants looked healthy above ground, but their roots had never grown deep enough to hold firmly against strong wind. This part of the field could fall first. Clara marked 9 acres on her map. The western strip had been harvested because it was dry enough. This section presented the opposite problem. It was wetter but more vulnerable. She climbed into the combine and cut only the weakest 3 acres. The machine worked harder as the damp straw entered the header. The grain landed heavily in the tank. After 3 acres, Clara stopped. Continuing would protect more wheat from wind, but it would create another large volume of wet grain needing immediate airflow. She shut down the engine. The remaining 6 acres would have to stand. Waiting did not mean refusing to act. It meant deciding which risks could be reduced without creating worse ones. As Clara unloaded the grain, headlights appeared on the road. Silas's truck entered the yard and stopped sharply beside the shed. He climbed out. "You called Ellen about the bins?" "No. She asked my crew whether her grain was safe." "It was a reasonable question. You're making people nervous." "The storm did that before I said anything." Silas pointed toward the untouched field. "You still have enough time to finish harvesting. And store the grain where? I'll make room. In the northern bins?" His expression tightened. Clara stepped closer. "How warm are they?" "They're safe. Have you checked the center?" Silas looked toward her small bin, where the ventilation fan continued humming. "You think one test makes you an expert? No. It tells me what wet grain does when it sits. This crop doesn't need to be perfect," Silas said. "It needs to survive the storm." Clara held his gaze. "And after that, does it survive the bin? Does it survive inspection? Does the buyer still take it?" Before Silas could answer, his radio crackled. A worker's voice came through. "Silas, we have condensation forming inside the roof of bin 7. Silas grabbed the radio. "Raise the fan speed. It's already at full power. Move the top layer. The auger crew is still at bin 3. Silas looked at Clara. The first clear warning had not appeared in the clouds. It had appeared inside the storage system. He raised the radio again. "I'm coming." Before returning to his truck, he looked toward Clara's wheat. "This proves nothing about the storm. I know. You could still lose the field. I know that too." Silas drove away. Clara remained beside the shed as thunder rolled across the western ridge. She checked the radar once more. The northern section of the storm had strengthened. The southern section continued to slow. The gap between them was widening, but the farm still sat too close to the center to be safe. Clara looked toward the standing wheat. One danger was approaching through the sky. The other had already begun building inside the bins. And before the night ended, the valley would learn which one it should have feared more. By 8 that evening, Red Willow Valley had gone quiet in the wrong way. The combines had stopped. The roads were nearly empty. Farm families had moved indoors, leaving behind fields cut down to stubble, grain trucks parked beneath sheds, and storage bins filled faster than anyone had planned. Only the wind kept moving. It pushed through Clara's standing wheat in long waves, bending the heads and releasing a dry whisper across the field. Inside the kitchen, the phone rang again. County First Bank. Clara watched the screen for a moment before answering. "Ms. Bennett," Daniel Mercer said, "we need an update. I harvested the western strip and 3 acres from the southwest corner. And the remaining crop? Still standing." A pause followed. "That is the majority of your collateral. It is also still too wet. The storm is expected within hours." "I know. The bank's concern is whether your decision meets the standard of reasonable protection." Clara looked toward the dark window. "What would you consider reasonable? Completing the harvest while equipment is available, and placing wet grain into full bins. That is a storage issue. It becomes a loan issue if the grain spoils." Daniel's voice tightened. "We cannot evaluate every operational detail from the bank, but you're evaluating my decision without them." Another silence. When Daniel spoke again, his tone was less formal. "Clara, I am trying to help you. If the crop is destroyed tonight, the bank may have no choice but to review the loan immediately." The meaning was clear. A failed harvest could cost her the farm before winter. Clara rested one hand on the table. "If I cut it now, where do you suggest I store it?" "Mr. Reed has offered temporary capacity. His northern bins are already showing condensation." Daniel hesitated. "You spoke with him?" "I spoke with someone who did. I was told the situation was under control." "Then ask whether bin 7 has cooled." Daniel did not answer. Clara continued. "The grain is not safe simply because it is no longer in the field. We still need a decision before the storm arrives. You have one." She ended the call before he could reply. For several seconds, the kitchen was silent. Then another sound came from outside. An engine. Headlights swept across the window and stopped beside the machinery shed. Silas had returned. This time, he had not come alone. One of his largest combines followed the truck, its header raised above the road. 2 empty grain trailers waited behind it. Clara stepped onto the porch. Silas walked toward her, holding a folder beneath one arm. "I brought enough equipment to finish before midnight," he said. "I didn't ask you to." "You don't need to." The combine engine remained running. Its lights illuminated the field, turning the wheat silver against the dark sky. "What's in the folder?" Clara asked. "A solution." Silas placed it on the porch railing. The first page was a harvest agreement. He would provide the machine, crew, trailers, and temporary storage. The second page contained additional terms. If Clara failed to repay the cost after the grain was sold, Silas would receive the first right to purchase the farm. The price had already been written in. It was lower than his previous offer. "You came prepared," Clara said. "I came because this is your last chance." "You mean your last chance?" Silas's jaw tightened. "If I wanted the land badly enough to let your crop fail, I would have stayed home." Clara looked at the combine. With that machine, the remaining wheat could be cut quickly. The immediate danger would be gone. So would her control over what happened next. "How much room do you actually have?" she asked. "Enough. That isn't a number. We can use temporary storage until the dryers catch up. Open piles, covered ground bins. With what airflow?" Silas exhaled sharply. "You are hours away from a severe storm, and you are asking about fan capacity." "Yes, because you would rather lose the field than admit you waited too long." Clara opened the folder again. The agreement was simple. Sign, and the wheat would be removed. Refuse, and she alone would carry the risk. Thunder rolled in the distance, closer than before. Silas lowered his voice. "Your father would have protected the crop." Clara looked down at the signature line. For the first time that day, she doubted her decision more than she trusted it. The forecast had worsened. The pressure was falling. The storm could still cross directly over the farm. Her observations had never guaranteed otherwise. If hail arrived, there might be nothing left by morning but broken stalks and debt. Clara picked up the pen. Silas said nothing. He did not need to. The combine waited behind him, ready to enter the field. Clara placed the pen above the page, then a grain truck appeared on the county road. It was moving slowly, its hazard lights flashing. As it passed the farm, steam like moisture drifted from beneath the tarp. The truck turned into Silas's northern storage yard. Clara watched until the taillights disappeared. "What was in that load?" she asked. "Wheat. From today?" "Yes. It's still warm enough to release moisture under the tarp. That happens. Not when the grain is stable." Silas reached for the folder. "Clara," his radio interrupted him. A worker spoke quickly through the static. "Bin 7 is at 103 near the center." Silas grabbed the radio. "What was the last reading?" 94. "How long ago?" "Just under an hour." Clara looked at him. "A 9-degree rise in less than 60 minutes. Silas turned away. "Move grain out of the center. We don't have an empty bin. Use the south shed. It still has seed in it. Then move the seed." "Where?" Silas did not answer immediately. The radio crackled again. "We're also getting a sour smell near the access door." Clara lowered the pen. Silas's expression changed from irritation to calculation. He was no longer thinking about her field. He was thinking about how quickly heat could move through thousands of bushels of damp grain. "Go," Clara said. Silas looked at her. "You still need to sign." "No. You may lose everything tonight. And if I sign, I may lose it more slowly. This is not the time for pride." "It isn't pride." Clara held out the folder. "You cannot protect my grain because you no longer have space to protect your own." Silas did not take it. For a moment, the two of them stood beneath the porch light while the combine idled in the yard. Then the first cold gust reached the farm. The wheat bent hard toward the east. The porch light flickered. Silas looked toward the field. "You think the storm will turn?" "I think it might." "That is not enough." "No," Clara said. "But the grain heating in your bins is not a possibility anymore." His radio sounded again. This time he answered before the worker finished speaking. "Pull the combine back. Bring both trailers to the north yard." The machine in Clara's yard began reversing. Silas took the folder, folded it once, and placed it under his arm. Before returning to the truck, he faced Clara. "If this field is gone by morning, no one will call this courage." "I know. They'll call it foolishness." "I know that too." He climbed into the truck and led the equipment away. The yard darkened after the headlights disappeared. Clara stood alone on the porch. She had refused the safest-looking option. That did not make her decision safe. She went back inside and opened her father's notebook. For several minutes she searched for another observation, another pattern, anything that could tell her she had chosen correctly. There was nothing. Only records of previous seasons, previous storms, previous mistakes. The past could guide her, but it could not decide for her. Clara closed the book. Then she returned to the field. The wind had strengthened, but it was no longer blowing steadily. It came in short, uneven bursts from the southwest, followed by quieter air from the south. Above the ridge, lightning flashed almost continuously. The storm was close. Clara walked to the red ribbon on the northern fence. It snapped east for several seconds. Then it twisted and pulled northeast. The direction was still changing. She checked the drainage channels one final time, secured the shed doors, and moved the small bin of harvested grain farther beneath the roof. There was nothing more to prepare. At 10:41 p.m., the first drops of rain struck the metal shed, large, widely spaced. Clara stood in the doorway and watched dark circles appear in the dust. Across the valley, a warning siren began to sound. The wheat bent under another gust. For the first time, several stalks near the southwest corner remained down after the wind passed. Clara gripped the doorframe. Waiting had cost her the trust of the bank. It had cost her Silas's help. Before morning, it might cost her the farm. Then the rain began in earnest. The rain struck the shed roof like thrown gravel. Within minutes, the yard disappeared behind a gray curtain. Water ran along the wheel tracks, filled the shallow ruts, and rushed toward the drainage channel Clara had cleared that afternoon. For a moment, the channel held. Then the wind changed. A violent gust hit from the west, shaking the shed doors and bending the cottonwoods almost sideways. Somewhere near the barn, metal slammed against wood. Clara grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside. The rain stung her face. She could barely see beyond the yard, but the wheat was still visible in brief flashes of lightning. The center field moved in heavy waves. The southwest corner did not. Several rows had already gone down. Clara pulled her coat tighter and ran toward the drainage outlet. Water was rising behind a pile of leaves and broken stalks that had collected against the grate. If the outlet blocked, runoff from the upper yard would spill into the lower field. She dropped to her knees and pulled the debris free with both hands. Mud covered her sleeves. Cold water filled her boots. The blockage gave way suddenly, and the backed-up water surged through the channel. Clara stepped aside before it knocked her down. The drainage system was working, but the storm was getting stronger. A flash of lightning exposed the western windbreak. One of the older cottonwoods had split near the top. A large branch hung over the fence, striking the trees beside it whenever the wind rose. If it fell inward, it could crush part of the windbreak and open the center field to the full force of the storm. Clara moved toward it, then stopped. The branch was too large to cut safely in that wind. Her father had taught her to protect the farm. He had also taught her not to become another emergency. She backed away. The branch would have to fall where it fell. Another gust crossed the field. This time, the wheat near the western edge bent nearly flat. Clara watched, unable to move. When the gust passed, most of the stalks slowly rose again. Not all of them. The loss was spreading. She returned to the shed and closed the doors behind her. The power failed at 11:18 p.m. The ventilation fan beneath the test grain stopped. Clara switched on the backup generator, but it coughed twice and died. She checked the fuel line. Air had entered the system. The grain in the small bin was already warm. Without airflow, its temperature would continue to rise. Clara opened the side panel and used a shovel to spread the grain into a thinner layer across the shed floor. It was slower than a fan, but the increased surface area would let some heat escape. As she worked, the radio came alive on battery power. "The northern section of the storm has intensified," the announcer said. "The strongest winds and hail are now tracking toward the ridge communities north of Red Willow." Clara stopped shoveling. The southern section was still moving toward the valley, but more slowly. The storm was dividing, just as the signs had suggested. Then the announcer continued. "Residents should not assume the danger has passed. Strong, straight-line winds remain possible throughout the Central Valley." Clara looked toward the closed shed doors. The farm was not safe. It was simply no longer facing the worst part of the system. At 11:43, the wind reached its peak. The shed groaned. The lights of the distant houses vanished one by one. Clara heard the cottonwood branch finally break. The sound was deep and sharp, followed by a heavy crash near the western fence. Then came a different noise, a long metallic tearing above her. One sheet of roofing began lifting from the back corner of the shed. Clara climbed onto a storage platform and reached for the rope she had secured around the support beam earlier that evening. The roof panel rose again. She pulled the rope tight and tied it lower around a steel bracket. The next gust nearly tore it from her hands, but the knot held. For several minutes, Clara remained on the platform, listening to the wind test every weak point in the building. She could do nothing for the wheat now. The decision had already been made. The field would either endure or it would not. Shortly after midnight, hail began to strike the roof. Clara froze. The sound started lightly, then grew harder. Small white stones bounced through a gap beneath the shed door. She picked one up. It was smaller than a pea, not harmless but far less damaging than the large hail predicted earlier. The hail lasted 4 minutes. Then it became rain again. Clara exhaled, though she did not feel relieved. A narrow hail core could still have crossed another part of the farm. She would not know until daylight. By 1 in the morning, the wind weakened. The rain remained heavy, but it no longer drove sideways through the cracks in the shed. Clara opened the door a few inches. The yard was flooded in shallow sections, but the drainage channels continued carrying water away. The western windbreak was damaged. One cottonwood had lost its crown. Another leaned toward the road. Beyond them, the field was mostly hidden in darkness. Clara raised the flashlight. The beam reached only the nearest rows. Some stalks stood. Others were flattened into the mud. She closed the door. There was no reason to walk the field before sunrise. In the darkness, she would see only fragments and imagine the rest. Clara sat on an overturned bucket beside the spread grain. The shed smelled of wet soil, oil, and warm wheat. Her hands shook now that there was nothing left to do. She thought of the bank, of Silas's contract, of the field bending under the wind. Her choice had never been between safety and danger. It had been between two dangers, both capable of destroying the harvest in different ways. At 2:07 a.m., her phone received a weak signal. Several messages arrived at once. Ellen had sent the first, "Hail north of us, roof damaged, are you okay?" Another came from the weather service. "The severe hail core has moved north of Red Willow Valley." Then a message from an unknown number appeared. "Fire department requested at Reed Storage Yard. Possible grain heating in bin 7. Clara read it twice. The storm had moved north. The danger inside the bins had not moved at all. She tried calling Silas. No answer. Outside, the rain softened. Clara stepped into the yard. Clouds still covered the sky, but the western horizon had begun to lighten. The storm was passing. She walked to the edge of the field. At first she saw only damage. The southwest section had collapsed in broad patches. Water stood between the rows. Broken branches lay across part of the western strip. Then the gray morning light spread farther across the land. The center field appeared. Bent, soaked, and uneven, but still standing. Clara did not celebrate. She counted the visible damage instead. Several acres were down. Some grain had shattered. The windbreak would need major repairs. The crop had survived, but it had not escaped. That mattered. Her decision had not been perfect. It had simply prevented one risk without completely avoiding the other. An orange glow appeared beyond the northern road. Clara first thought it was sunrise. Then she saw dark smoke rising behind Silas's storage yard. She turned toward the road. The storm had finished making its choice. Now the valley would discover what the early harvest had cost. By sunrise, the storm had moved north. Clara's field was damaged, but most of the wheat still stood. The southwest corner had taken the worst of the wind, and several acres were flattened beyond recovery. The center field, protected by the windbreak, had survived. The smoke beyond Silas Reed's storage yard was more serious. Clara drove there after checking her drainage channels and securing the damaged shed roof. Fire trucks lined the entrance. Workers were pulling grain from bin 7 while large fans forced air through the open access doors. There were no flames. The smoke came from grain that had heated deep inside the bin. Damp wheat had been loaded too quickly and packed too densely. Moisture had moved upward. Condensation had formed beneath the roof, and the center had begun heating faster than the fans could cool it. Silas stood beside the unloading auger, his clothes soaked from the storm. "How bad is it?" Clara asked. "We caught it before ignition," he said, "but part of the grain is already damaged." A sour smell drifted from the bin. Nearby, workers spread darkened wheat across the concrete to release heat. Some kernels had clumped together. Others were beginning to discolor. Ellen Holloway stood beside one of the trucks. "Is that ours?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Silas looked at the loading records. Some of it. Ellen stared at the grain on the ground. Her family had harvested early to save the crop from the storm. Now part of that crop might be rejected or downgraded because it had entered storage too wet. More trucks began arriving as other farmers checked their bins. Several reported warm grain. One had moisture dripping from the roof. Another had already noticed a fermented smell. The problem was larger than Bin 7. The valley had moved its harvest out of the storm, but it had moved too much of it into storage at the same time. Silas turned to Clara. "You were right about the moisture." Clara looked toward the damaged grain. "I was right that it was a risk." "That sounds like the same thing." "It isn't." She pointed toward the northern fields, where hail had destroyed several farms. "If the storm had crossed 10 miles farther south, my field might be gone." Waiting worked, because the worst of the storm missed us. Silas said nothing. Clara continued, "The mistake was not harvesting early. The mistake was treating every field, every load, and every bin as though they were the same." Silas looked back at Bin 7. For years, the valley had trusted speed. This time, speed had created a second emergency. By mid-morning, grain buyers had begun inspecting loads. Some accepted the wheat at a reduced price. Some required additional drying. Several loads from the warmest bins were rejected. The news spread quickly. The farmers who had mocked Clara for leaving her field untouched were no longer laughing, but Clara had no reason to celebrate. She had lost part of her crop. Her windbreak was damaged, and the standing wheat still needed time to dry before the next rain. When she returned home, Daniel Mercer from the bank was waiting near the porch. "I heard most of your field survived," he said. "Most of it. And the reed bins? Some grain is damaged." Daniel glanced toward the wheat. "You made a difficult call. I made a risky one. A successful one." Clara shook her head. "Not yet. The crop was still outside. The soil was wet. The combine could not enter until the ground dried enough to carry its weight. The storm had passed, but the harvest was not finished." Clara walked into the field and tested a kernel. It was harder than the day before. The wind following the storm was cool and dry. If it held, the grain could be ready within 2 days. If another rain arrived first, the delay could still cost her. Daniel watched her record the result in her notebook. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now I wait for the field to become ready." "You're still willing to wait?" Clara looked across the bent but standing wheat. "I didn't wait because I believed nothing could go wrong." She closed the notebook. "I waited because rushing would have created a problem I already understood." That afternoon, the clouds began to break. Sunlight reached the field for the first time since the warning. The wheat lifted slightly as it dried. Not all of it would recover, but enough remained to save the farm. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe that the hardest decision might be behind her. She was wrong. The grain buyer called before sunset. If Clara could not deliver within 48 hours, her contract would be canceled. The grain buyer gave Clara 48 hours. After that, the contract would be canceled and the wheat would have to be sold on the open market at a lower price. Clara checked the field again at sunset. The topsoil was still soft from the storm. A loaded combine could sink in the lower sections, damaging both the machine and the crop. But the wind had turned dry. The kernels were hardening quickly. She took samples from the ridge, the center, and the low ground. The ridge was nearly ready. The center needed another day. The low field remained too wet. Once again, the farm could not be treated as a single decision. Clara called the grain buyer. "I can deliver part of the order tomorrow," she said. "The rest the following day. The contract requires 1 delivery window. Then inspect the first load before you cancel anything." The buyer hesitated. "What makes you think the quality will be different?" "Because I did not harvest all of it at the same moisture level." He agreed to test the first truck. The next morning, Clara started before sunrise. She harvested the ridge first, where the soil was firm and the wheat had dried fastest. The old combine moved slowly, but it held together. By noon, the first truck was loaded. The buyer tested the grain at the elevator. The moisture was within range. The kernels were clean, firm, and free of the sour odor already appearing in some early harvested loads. "This is better than most of what we received yesterday," the inspector said. "Will you keep the contract open?" "For 24 more hours." Clara returned to the farm immediately. The center field was ready by late afternoon, but the lower ground was still soft. She harvested only where the combine could pass without sinking. Silas arrived before dark with one empty truck. "I can haul for you," he said. Clara looked at him carefully. "No contract?" "No contract." He glanced toward the damaged wheat near the southwest corner. "I was wrong to push you into treating the whole field the same." Clara nodded toward the lower section. "That part still isn't ready. You may miss the deadline." "I may." Silas looked at the firm ground near the center. "Then let's finish what is ready." They worked through the night. Silas hauled the grain while Clara operated the combine. By dawn, most of the standing wheat had been cut. The lower field remained untouched. Clara had enough grain to complete the contract without risking the machine or mixing wetter kernels into the dry loads. At the elevator, the final truck passed inspection. The buyer signed the delivery receipt. The farm payment was now possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. When Clara returned home, the sun was rising over the stubble. Only a narrow section of wheat remained in the low ground. Some neighbors might have called it unfinished. Clara saw it differently. The field had been harvested according to what each part could safely give. And for the first time since her father's death, the farm had survived a season on her judgment. By the end of the week, Red Willow Valley looked divided. On one side of the roads were clean fields reduced to stubble. On the other were grain yards crowded with rejected loads, temporary drying fans, and trucks waiting for new instructions. The storm had passed. Its consequences had not. Several farmers had saved their wheat from hail only to lose part of its value in storage. Damp grain had been downgraded. Some loads had to be dried again at high cost. Others were blended with better grain just to make them marketable. Clara's wheat had passed inspection. That fact traveled through the valley faster than the original warning. People began saying she had predicted the storm. She corrected them whenever she heard it. "I did not know where it would go," she told Ellen. "I knew my grain was too wet." That difference mattered to her. She had not defeated the weather. She had simply refused to let fear erase what the field was telling her. 2 days after completing the contract, Clara returned to the lower section. The soil had firmed under the dry wind. The remaining wheat was uneven and partly bent, but the kernels were finally hard. She started the combine. This was not the urgent harvest the valley had made before the storm. There were no headlights, no line of trucks, and no radio warnings. The machine moved slowly through the last rows. Some grain had been lost. The storm had shaken kernels from the weakest heads, and the low ground produced less than Clara had hoped. Still, the harvest was worth taking. By noon, the final section was finished. Silas arrived while Clara was unloading the last tank. He stood beside the wagon and watched the grain fall. "I heard the bank accepted your payment plan," he said. "They accepted the first payment. That is more than most people expected." Clara shut down the auger. "Most people expected me to sell. I did." She looked at him. Silas did not avoid the truth. "I thought the farm was too much for you," he continued. "And I thought speed would solve the storm. It solved one problem and created another." His northern bins had been emptied and inspected. Part of the wheat was recoverable, but several loads had lost enough quality to erase the profit Silas expected from the early harvest. For the first time in years, his size had worked against him. He had more machinery, more grain, more storage, and far less room to change course once everything began moving. Silas looked toward Clara's old shed. "Is your smaller drying bin still available?" "It is. I have one load from the eastern farm that needs controlled airflow. The main dryers are still backed up." Clara understood what he was asking. Before the storm, Silas had offered her storage in exchange for control over her land. Now he needed the small system he had dismissed. "You can use it," she said. "What will it cost?" "Fuel, electricity, and any repairs." "That's all?" Clara looked across the field. "No land agreement." Silas nodded once. "No land agreement." That afternoon, his truck delivered the grain. Clara monitored the temperature and moved the wheat in smaller batches. It was slower than commercial storage, but the airflow remained steady, and the grain cooled without further damage. Silas stayed long enough to see the first reading fall. "You built this from your father's design?" he asked. "He built the original system. I changed the airflow." Silas studied the fan housing. "I called this place outdated. Some of it is, and some of it, was designed for a smaller amount of grain and more attention. Silas gave a quiet laugh. That may be what the valley forgot. The reversal was not dramatic. Silas did not apologize in front of the town. The bank did not erase Clara's debt. The storm did not leave her untouched. But something had changed. People stopped asking when she would sell. They began asking how she had divided the field, how she had tested the grain, and why the lower section ripened later. Clara answered when she could. She never told them to ignore forecasts. She told them to use forecasts as one part of a larger decision. The storm warning had been accurate. The danger had been real. The failure came from treating every farm as though it faced the same conditions, and every load of grain as though it could be stored the same way. At sunset, Clara stood beside the final wagon of wheat. The field was empty now, not because she had rushed, because it had finally been ready. She opened her father's notebook and wrote beneath the record of the storm, harvested in sections, lost part of the southwest corner, center quality held, lower field finished 6 days later. She paused, then added one more line. The field was never asking us to do nothing. It was asking us not to do everything at once. A week after the harvest, the valley gathered at the cooperative hall. The meeting had been called to discuss storage losses, delayed deliveries, and the cost of drying grain that had been cut too early. Clara sat near the back. She had no intention of giving a speech, but when the discussion turned to the storm, several farmers began referring to her as the woman who had known it would change direction. Clara finally stood. "I didn't know," she said. The room quieted. The forecast was not wrong. The storm was dangerous. It destroyed fields north of us and damaged part of mine. She looked toward Ellen, then Silas. What I knew was that my wheat was still wet, the storage system was filling too quickly, and different parts of my field were not ready at the same time. One farmer raised his hand. "So you trusted the old signs instead of the weather service?" "No," Clara replied. "I trusted both." She explained that the forecast had shown the regional risk, while the field had shown the local conditions. The kernels showed maturity. The soil showed where machinery could travel. The windbreak showed which sections had protection. The drainage channels showed where water would move. The storage bins showed how much wet grain the system could safely handle. No single sign had given her the answer. The answer came from reading them together. Silas stood beside the wall with his arms folded. "We made one decision for the whole valley," he said. "Harvest everything. Store everything. Dry it later." He looked around the room. We had enough machines to do it. We did not have enough capacity to manage what came next. No one argued. The cooperative agreed to make changes before the following season. More portable moisture testers would be available during harvest. Temporary storage would require active temperature monitoring. Farmers would be encouraged to separate wetter loads instead of mixing them with dry grain. Silas offered to upgrade the northern bins. Clara offered copies of the field zone map she had made from her father's records. The changes would not eliminate risk. Nothing could. But the valley would no longer confuse speed with preparation. That evening, Clara returned home and walked to the northern fence. The red ribbon was still tied to the old post, faded and torn by the storm. Beyond it, the harvested field lay quiet beneath the setting sun. The southwest corner remained rough where the wheat had fallen. Broken cottonwood branches were stacked beside the damaged windbreak. Repairs would take weeks. The farm had survived, but it had not escaped without a cost. Clara preferred it that way. A perfect victory would have turned the lesson into a myth. This was more honest. She opened her father's notebook. For years, his handwriting had filled the pages. His decisions, mistakes, and observations had guided her through the season. Now only a few blank pages remained. Clara wrote, "The forecast warned us what could happen. The grain showed what was already happening. The field did not ask me to ignore the storm. It asked me to understand the price of running from it too soon." She closed the notebook. A truck approached along the county road and slowed beside the fence. It was Daniel Mercer from the bank. He lowered the window. "We received your payment this morning," he said. "I know. The loan review has been postponed." "For how long?" "Until after next season." It was not forgiveness. It was time. For a farm carrying debt, time was often the most valuable thing anyone could offer. Daniel glanced across the harvested field. "People say you save the crop by reading the weather." Clara looked at the damaged corner. the repaired drainage channels, and the small drying bin beside the shed. "No," she said. "I saved enough of it by reading the whole farm." Daniel nodded and drove away. Clara remained by the fence until the truck disappeared. Across Red Willow Valley, farmers had harvested before the storm because they were afraid of losing everything. Clara had waited because she understood that loss could begin in more than one place. It could begin beneath dark clouds. It could begin inside a sealed grain bin. And sometimes, it could begin the moment fear convinced everyone that the fastest decision had to be the right one. The young woman had not defeated the storm. She had simply refused to let it make every decision for her. By the following spring, Red Willow Valley had changed. The cooperative installed new temperature sensors in its older bins. Farmers began testing moisture from different parts of their fields instead of relying on one sample. Several families added small aeration systems so wet grain could be separated before entering the main storage. No one claimed the changes would prevent every loss. They simply gave people more options than panic. Clara repaired the western windbreak with young cedar and cottonwood trees. The damaged southwest corner was planted with a cover crop to strengthen the soil and encourage deeper roots before wheat returned. Silas helped deliver the trees. He did not mention his old offer to buy the farm. Neither did Clara. Their relationship had not become a friendship, but it had become something more useful: respect. When planting season arrived, Clara stood at the edge of the lower field with her father's notebook in one hand and a new blank journal in the other. The old book was nearly full. For months she had depended on its records, but the farm was changing, and the next decisions could not all come from the past. She opened the new journal and wrote the date. Then she recorded the soil temperature, the direction of the wind, and the moisture near the old creek bed. Below those notes she added, "Keep the knowledge, question the habit." A tractor moved slowly across the field, placing seed into the dark soil. From the road, the farm looked ordinary: an aging shed, a repaired fence, young trees where older ones had broken. But Clara no longer saw a property waiting to be saved. She saw a living system that had to be observed, tested, and understood one season at a time. The storm had not proven that she was always right. It had taught the valley something more valuable. Forecasts could warn them, machines could help them, experience could guide them, but none of those things removed the need to pay attention. Clara closed the journal and watched the planter begin another row. The next harvest was months away. There would be heat, insects, mechanical failures, and perhaps another storm. She could not control any of them, but when the time came to choose, she would not follow fear simply because everyone else was moving. She would stop, she would test, and she would listen to the field before making the first cut. Months later, another storm warning appeared on the radio. It was smaller than the one before, but strong enough to make farmers check equipment, storage space, and weather maps. This time, the valley did not rush all at once. Some fields were ready and were harvested immediately. Others were tested first. Wetter grain was separated. Storage temperatures were monitored before the bins were filled. The storm passed with little damage. To most people, it was an ordinary weather event. To Clara, it was proof that the valley had learned not to ignore warnings, not to distrust technology, but to pause long enough to understand what each farm actually needed. That evening, she walked along the northern fence. The young trees in the repaired windbreak were still small, but their roots had taken hold. The cover crop in the southwest corner had thickened the soil where the wheat had once fallen. The old red ribbon remained tied to the fence post. It no longer served as her only guide. Clara now had better instruments, stronger storage, and another year of records. Still, she left it there. It reminded her of the morning when every farmer in the valley had rushed to harvest and her field had stood untouched. People later called that decision brave. Some called it brilliant. Clara knew it had been neither. It had been careful. She had listened to the forecast, tested the grain, studied the wind, checked the soil, and accepted that no choice was free from danger. The lesson was not that waiting was always right. The lesson was that fear should never be the only reason to move. Clara opened her new journal and wrote one final note beneath the season's records. Read the warning, read the field, then decide. She closed the book as the sun lowered behind the western ridge. Across Red Willow Valley, machines rested inside their sheds. The bins were cool. The fields were quiet, and for the first time, no one mistook that quiet for hesitation.